Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, a lot of you commented and said that you really enjoyed that I did a reaction to Re-Syndicated for the first time. And among the suggestions you had for maybe a follow-up reaction was this video on Boston Corbett, who is the man who killed John Wilkes Booth. Now, being a student of the Civil War, I am at least somewhat familiar with Boston Corbett's story, some pretty serious mental health issues that happened later in his life, and of course what happened on the day at that barn when he shot John Wilkes Booth. But I'm excited to learn more and to find out some things maybe I didn't know, and I'll try to add my own information along the way as the situation warrants. But as always, a link is in the description to check out the original content. He's growing fast. I think 2 weeks ago he only had something like 1,500 subscribers. He's up over 4,000 now, so I'm glad to see that Re-Syndicated is seeing some growth in his channel, and hopefully that will continue. Let's dive in.
Before dawn on April 26, 1865, assassin John Wilkes Booth had been cornered by the United States Army. Nearly 2 weeks prior, Booth had become the most wanted man in the country after he shot and killed President Abraham Lincoln.
So a little context here. John Wilkes Booth is a pretty popular actor at this point. He's the kind of person that anybody who attends the theater or things like that would have recognized. He is their version of a modern day like Hollywood celebrity. So when you're a pretty substantially known actor, you're gonna have a hard time hiding very easily. People are gonna recognize you, and I think he misunderstood how this would be received, and if anything, he probably ended up hurting the South more than he realized. But interesting side note, and I know many of you are already familiar with this, but there was an incident that took place not long before this where Abraham Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, almost went off of a train platform into a train, and he was pulled back by someone who saved his life, and it was Edwin Booth. It was John Wilkes Booth's brother, who was also a pretty famous actor in his own right, and it was said that that gave Edwin Booth a lot of comfort to know that he had at least saved the president's son after what his brother ended up doing.
He'd been on the run ever since, and the 16th New York Cavalry Regiment was tasked with hunting him down and bringing him to justice. Cavalry. Booth was trapped inside a barn and refused to be taken alive. Meanwhile, Sergeant Boston Corbett eyed him from a crack in the wall. He witnessed Booth raising his weapon. Disobeying orders to take Booth alive, Corbett fired a single shot. Booth was paralyzed, and 3 agonizing hours later, he died. The public instantly hailed Corbett as a national hero.
So I think they brought him out on the porch of the house there, and at one point he asked them to raise his hands up so he could see him. Remember, he's paralyzed because the bullet hit him in the spine, and I guess his last words were useless, useless, you know, his hands, and then he died.
And he would go down in history as Lincoln's Avenger. Apart from this single act, Boston Corbett was not a notable figure of the Civil War. That is not to say, however, that he did not lead an interesting life. In fact, the killing of Booth was only one of many unique stories from his life, some which would mark him as a hero and others a madman. With the birth name Thomas, Corbett was born on January 29, 1832
I don't think I knew he was born in
London. His family was continually moving until finally settling in the United States in Troy, New York, when he was 8 years old. A young man in his early 20s, Corbett married Susan Rebecca, a woman 13 years his senior. For a living, he made hats.
So it says that the last name is unknown and no photographs exist. I find myself curious about my abilities in genealogy to see if we can't figure out what her name was. So I'm going to go do a little digging. Well, given that he lived in New York City, there are a lot of Thomas Corbetts who were born in England or in Ireland who were living there. So it was really hard to kind of narrow it down. I'm sure with a lot of searching we could probably get to the bottom of this, but apparently she lost the child that they had and died in the childbirth, so there's not a lot of records.
A woman 13 years his senior. For a living, he made hats. It was a trade he'd learned as a teenager. Not even 2 years into the marriage, Susan died giving birth to a stillborn child. Emotionally devastated, he moved to Boston, Massachusetts, and tried to keep working, but he was unable to rebound. He became an alcoholic wandering the streets at night. His habits eventually cost him his job. He became homeless. One night, a street minister stopped a drunken Corbett and evangelized to him. That night, his life changed. He immediately quit drinking and joined the Methodist Episcopalian Church, where he attended regular prayer meetings. In fact, it wasn't long before Corbett began to do the ministering himself.
So the Methodist Episcopal Church, as it was known, is one of the denominations that eventually became today's United Methodist Church. There were the Methodist Episcopals, which you'll see a lot of ME churches in the 19th century. Very, very common. The Methodists come out of John Wesley's teaching, and Wesley wanted to just kind of reform things in the Church of England, but couldn't make it happen, so they became the Methodist Episcopal, because they were still Episcopal, being the Church of England in the U.S. And the ME Church eventually joins, I think, with the Evangelical United Brethren to form the United Methodist Church. And yeah, you'll notice in a lot of these pictures how it looks like his hair's long, but then it's cut short here. Well, he grew his hair out long because he wanted to be like Jesus, but then he had to have it cut for the military service. So when you see a lot of these pictures in his uniform, you can see how he's had to have his hair cut short, but he still kind of wishes it was long.
Wanting to share his miraculous transformation. Among the church members, Corbett earned a reputation for being eccentric. He was exceptionally loud and flamboyant during praise and worship, and even during sermons. A frequent phrase he shouted, "Glory to God, come to Christ," earned him the nickname, the Glory to God Man.
The Glory to God Man.
The appearance of Jesus Christ, he grew out a beard and exceptionally long hair. He'd change his name to Boston Corbett in honor of the city of his rebirth. His boldness wasn't limited to the walls of the church. No longer an alcoholic, he returned to work as a hatter, where he regularly proselytized to co-workers and sang hymns aloud. A swear word or mention of alcohol from his co-workers would send him to his knees to pray for them.
Wow.
This made keeping a job difficult, but
Could you imagine being a soldier with this guy in the cavalry? And listen, I'm not passing judgment on him. I love that he's got such excitement about his faith, although I know it's going to take him off the deep end before all is said and done. But imagine being a soldier with this guy who every time you swear or something like that, he drops on his knees and starts praying for you. I gotta feel like he probably wasn't real popular among the other men.
Sometimes Corbett would leave of his own volition. He wouldn't work for immoral employers. One employer was fixing up used hats and selling them as new. Learning of this, Corbett promptly quit. When he wasn't at work, he'd seek out people to evangelize to. Walking the streets of Boston were many poor and destitute alcoholics who Corbett reached out to, encouraging them to drop their drinking habits, converting them to Christianity,
Nothing wrong with any
and
of that.
providing for their needs until they could find work. All of this while Corbett himself struggled to keep a job, but as one of his peers wrote, quote, "No amount of talk would change his ways." This often left him begging from his fellow congregation members
That's a problem.
who didn't mind helping. Corbett was always quick to pay his debts. The peak of his extreme behavior up to this point, however, would come on July 16, 1858. Walking home from a religious meeting, he was confronted by two prostitutes who propositioned him for sex. He declined, but was disturbed by his urges. At home, he read from the book of Matthew, quote, "And if thy hand or foot causeth thee to stumble, cut it off, and cast it from thee." And
All right, just if you're not familiar with Boston Corbett's story, just do the math here, right? He just got propositioned by prostitutes. It bothered him. Now he's reading Jesus talking about if your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and cast it away. He's being figurative. He's talking about how you need to cut things out of your life that might hold you back from being who you're called to be. And he's going to take it literally.
"And if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out, and cast it from thee." And
Jesus goes on to say basically it's better to lose an arm or an eye than to have your whole body be cast into hell because of your sin.
There be eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. On his own, without medical assistance, Corbett took a pair of scissors and chopped off his own testicles. He then ate a meal and attended another prayer meeting. In fact, he only received medical attention after someone else, learning of the injury, called for a doctor. Medical professionals were stunned, unable to imagine the pain he must have put himself through. He was simply eager to recover. The idea of preaching without the torment of temptation thrilled him. People of the Methodist Episcopal Church had a long history of being over the top, but even they found Corbett to be extreme.
I don't know how much I agree with the statement about Methodist Episcopal Church people being over the top. Had a lot of family members in the ME Church, and they all seemed to be pretty mainstream Christians, but maybe it was different in New England, I don't know.
His conversion had certainly been dramatic and emotional, but something more was likely causing his behavior. As the phrase "mad as a hatter" would suggest, the profession of making hats has been connected to mental illness. This is attributed to a regular exposure to mercury fumes. Symptoms of erethism, or Mad Hatter disease, include paranoia, delusions, hallucinations, and psychosis. All
right, there's something I didn't know. I did not know that that's where Mad as a Hatter came from, and that there's a connection between that trade and a certain mental illness, which makes total sense with ongoing exposure to mercury, though.
Only had Corbett worked as a hatter since his youth, but it's a profession he would regularly return to. As such, his eccentric behaviors would only increase throughout his life. The American Civil War broke out in April of 1861, and 29-year-old Boston Corbett was quick to enlist in the Union Army. His peculiarities were readily apparent. Corporal Edward Kirk, who served alongside Corbett, wrote, quote, "Almost daily something would occur which would mark him as different from others. For Corbett, even the hardships of war were no excuse to drink alcohol or to stop observing the Sabbath, and he insisted his fellow troops follow the same morals. Curse words were..."
And see, there is where you run into the issue. And without getting too much into this, obviously, if you're not familiar with me, I am a Christian. I'm also a pastor. When you start trying to take what you believe and externally try to change other people and get them to conform to things like observing the Sabbath, you're going about it wrong. That kind of change has to happen from the inside out. You don't change the external because you want people to live the way that you do when they don't share your faith.
Also off limits, he even reprimanded a superior for using the word damned. This earned him 2 days in a jail cell, but it didn't seem to bother him.
So wait a second, this is Dan Butterfield that he criticizes for this. That's amazing. Dan Butterfield wrote Taps. So if you're familiar with Taps, what we play at military funerals, things like that. Also a Medal of Honor recipient himself. Fascinating. I didn't know that either. Captain William Rayner arrested Corbett on the spot he stepped out of the ranks and called the colonel to order for swearing. Speaking of Corbett, Rayner later said he was the most troublesome man in my company. Big surprise. Surprises me then that he would have been on the mission to hunt down Booth, but if it was his unit and he was a part of that unit, I guess there's nothing you could do.
Earned him 2 days in a jail cell, but it didn't seem to bother him. Upon his release, he walked out smiling, saying he had a, quote, good time with his God and his Bible, and he gave no apology. Such defiance eventually led to a court-martial and discharge, though he would simply re-enlist later that same month. Still, Corbett showed many positive attributes. Corporal Kirk noted, quote, "He was a very religious man, faithful at his post of duty, a good speaker, and a skillful and helpful nurse to those who were ill or in distress, and he knew no fear."
And he ends up a sergeant, so he's obviously done something right.
This fearlessness showed in battle. When others retreated, Corbett stood and fought, proclaiming glory to God with each Confederate he shot. A particular heroic moment occurred in 1864. During his second enlistment, he was captured as a POW.
He went to
A
Andersonville.
fellow prisoner wrote about an incident while him and Corbett were among the 2,000 prisoners in transit to Andersonville prison. Quote, "There was a small stream of water close to the guard line, and the prisoners made a rush for it. Most of them had no water for many hours, but the guards kept them back. One of the more venturesome than the rest got through the line and attempted to fill his canteen. He was immediately shot in the arm with buckshot by one of the guards. He was pushed back among our men and laid under a tree. The wounded man was suffering greatly and called for water to ease his pain, but none had any in his canteen. Boston Corbett stepped out of the ranks, having been unable to stand silent any longer. He crossed the deadline."
So at Andersonville, and if you want to see, I'll put at the end, I'll put up a link to my video when I visited the Andersonville prison site. You'll see there's something called the deadline, and that was a fence that was inside of the main wall of the prison. And if you crossed the deadline, you got shot. So that's what they're talking about here.
Filled his canteen in the stream and gave the wounded man a drink. The guards continually threatened him with death, but Corbett ignored them and went about his business. Despite their threats, he returned unharmed and rejoined the ranks of prisoners. The cheers of the soldiers at this brave deed could have been heard 1 mile away, but Corbett seemed to think it was not out of the ordinary. "It was the bravest deed I had seen during the
Complicated
war."
guy.
Of course, his most notable act would come at the war's end. On April 14, 1865, 5 days after the surrender of General Lee, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by famous actor and Southern sympathizer John Wilkes Booth.
I'm curious to know a little bit more about his service, as far as like when did he get out of Andersonville, when was he promoted, things like that. So I want to take a look at his file. Okay, so here he is, 31-year-old hatter, enlisted on the 4th of August, 1863 at New York City as a private. He was mustered in the Company L, New York 16th Cavalry. He was captured on the 26th of June, 64 at Culpeper, Virginia, confined at Andersonville. He was paroled on November 15th. It's interesting. I wonder the reason for that. He was a corporal on the 6th of September of 63, so that was like a month after he joined the service. Was reduced to private in February of 64, then promoted back to sergeant, actually before he was paroled. Born in London, England, died. He was supposed to have died in Hinckley, Minnesota in a fire. We don't know for sure. And it says soldier who killed John Wilkes Booth. So, interesting.
Corbett's regiment was tasked with hunting down Booth. Booth's final stand was in a barn, which he refused to leave, saying he wouldn't be taken alive. While the other soldiers lit the barn on fire, attempting to force him out, Corbett eyed him through a crack in the wall. Acting on his own, he fired a fatal shot, which killed Booth. An immediate court-martial and arrest followed. Corbett fully acknowledged that he defied orders, but said it was done in self-defense as he saw Booth raising his weapon. He also claimed that he shot to wound, not to kill, but that a sudden movement from Booth resulted in the bullet being lodged in his head. Stories from witnesses contradict Corbett's claim. 2 men said they never saw Booth raise his weapon, nor any sign that Corbett was in danger.
Yeah, that makes sense, because you got to figure there were probably multiple people who were looking in and could see him, not just Boston Corbett.
The matter would never be investigated, however. After questioning Corbett, Secretary Edwin Stanton simply said, quote, "The rebel is dead. The patriot lives. He has spared his country expense, continued excitement, and trouble." Another potential reason for the leniency was that Corbett was now a national hero. After his release, he was greeted by a cheering crowd asking him for autographs. Photographer Matthew Brady ushered Corbett into his studio to take a portrait of the man now known as Lincoln's Avenger.
Yeah, this is why we've got so many pictures of a guy who, was a sergeant. Not something you're typically going to see multiple pictures with multiple different poses in a studio, unless the guy had paid for it himself.
Corbett, however, gave glory to God for avenging Lincoln. Furthermore, he refused offers to sell the pistol which he had used to shoot Booth. One of Booth's pistols was even offered to him, but not wanting a permanent reminder of the killing, he declined this as well. He received part of the reward for hunting Booth, and for his service, he received an annual salary. Following the war, he returned to his old habits, ministering and hat-making. Despite his hero status, keeping a job was still a challenge, as none of his fame had diminished his eccentric behavior. Job prospects became so scarce that by 1870, he'd tried to capitalize on his title as Lincoln's Avenger. At Sunday schools, women's groups, and tent meetings, he'd recount the killing of Booth. But he would ramble incoherently, and was therefore never reinvited. He was also described as, quote, speaking so rapidly that you could hardly follow him at all. This marks a contrast with Corporal Kirk's description of Corbett as a good speaker from a decade prior.
It's a contrast, but it also might show a continued regression in his mental illness. If he's continuing to work as a hatter, he's continuing to expose himself to this mercury, or if the stuff that he has already been dealing with mentally is just getting worse and worse.
This was possibly a sign of his declining mental health. Part of this decline was intense paranoia. Previously, he'd been unusually suspicious of certain people, but now fear was beginning to run his life. He was convinced that people in the government were bitter towards him because of the Booth killing. The government was deprived of the chance to try, execute, and make an example of the assassin. In fact, there were many who did openly resent Corbett, but he...
If you're wondering, by the way, that is a photo of the U.S. Capitol before it was expanded and the dome was added, the dome we have today, which was constructed in the I think it was finished in the 1860s.
Believed they were out to ruin his life. His inability to keep work wasn't, in his mind, a result of his behavior, but part of a conspiracy. But this wasn't his only conspiracy theory. He also believed men were out to kill him as vengeance for John Wilkes Booth. At all times, he kept a weapon with him. At the slightest of suspicions, he'd draw it on strangers or friends. Under his pillow, he kept a revolver and would frequently wake in the middle of the night to draw it. Even as he preached from the pulpit, there was a pistol at his side. Had anyone simply questioned his integrity, Corbett would whip out his gun. Rarely would he fire. The threats were enough to clear a room full of people. Once he even chased a group of men out of a building.
Wow.
In 1878, Corbett lived as a homesteader in Kansas. Though he was active in the church, he would become disliked by the community. In 1885, at age 52, he fired upon a group of boys who ran across his property. Later in...
Get off my lawn, boys! Wow. It's just... It's sad on one hand, but scary on another that this went on for this long, and it's really a small miracle that other people didn't end up dead because of him.
One boy's father accused Corbett of being a liar. At this accusation, Corbett brandished his gun, announcing that he'd fallen among thieves. After sending everyone running from the courtroom, Corbett simply got on his horse and returned home.
Jeez.
When officers came to arrest him, he stood at the door, rifle in hand, refusing to be arrested again. Charges against him were dropped. Those who managed to stay on Corbett's good side, such as friends from the war, still described him as a good man, but said that he was tormented by terror and paranoia.
Understatement.
Despite efforts to help him, Corbett's eccentric behavior, and now also his deadly paranoia, would ruin every opportunity.
I'll say this, the fact that he had friends that still cared enough to try and intervene in his life says that there had to have been some redeeming qualities there, right? Or at least a great deal of understanding from his friends that he was suffering from some severe mental illness and therefore wanted to help him. And I think that says a lot about the kind of people that he was around.
Would also finally get him arrested in 1887, only after a group of police cornered him and pinned him to the ground. He was sentenced to the Topeka Asylum for the Insane. But this wouldn't last long. Just a year later, he escaped on horseback. After this, official records on Corbett become scarce. Search parties weren't able to locate him. It was later learned that after the escape, he briefly stayed with an old friend from the war. He said that he was leaving for Mexico. After boarding a train in 1888, Boston Corbett, age 56, became a mystery. The whereabouts of Lincoln's Avenger became a matter of national intrigue. Over the following decades, men would occasionally claim to be Corbett, but all of them were found to be imposters. Likely, they were trying to claim his war pension.
Well, I mean, there's a pretty simple way to prove right off the bat whether they're Corbett or not, right? I mean, if you want to go there.
Some people believe that Corbett may have died in the Great Hinckley Fire. In September of 1894, a massive forest fire in Minnesota killed over 400 people. The list of dead and missing contained the name Thomas Corbett. This would have placed him nowhere near his claimed hiding place of Mexico. Furthermore, the surname Corbett was not uncommon, so it's possible it was simply another Thomas Corbett. But it's also possible that for some reason, Boston Corbett changed his route and was using his birth name Thomas as an alias. Nevertheless, his fate remains impossible to know. While some consider Boston Corbett to be nothing more than a madman, he is widely remembered as Lincoln's Avenger and as a national hero.
That was good. That was well researched, well put together. I enjoyed that. Definitely learned some things I didn't know. And again, it just goes to show you that just because somebody has a ton of subscribers or somebody only has a few subscribers, don't let that dictate to you how good or how bad or how worthy a channel is, because everybody starts somewhere. And this guy's, 2 weeks ago he had just over 1,000 subscribers, and I think there's a lot that we can learn from a channel like this. So as always, the link's in the description. If you want to check out his other videos, he's got a lot of stuff on presidential history that's very interesting. And I will throw up the link here for you on the screen if you want to check out my visit to the Andersonville prison site from a couple of years ago. Thanks for watching.